Respected Father Reggie P. Kurian, Principal of the College and President of this meeting, Professor Ram Kumar, the keynote speaker, Professor Johnson K. Joyce, Head of the Department of Economics, former heads and faculty members of the department, distinguished alumni members, especially Mr. Tina Paul, family members of CSET Scaria, sir, my esteemed colleagues and dear students. Good morning and warm welcome to 33rd Professor CSET Scaria Memorial Lecture. Our college and the department are all their doorsteps to the centenary year. The Department of Economics is one of the oldest departments of this college. We started the BA Economics program in the year 1934 and the MA program in 1957 and have instituted 3 memorial lectures in honor of our eminent faculties way back from 1980 onwards. Since its inception in 1922, our former faculty members strive hard to inspire young minds to be better citizens capable of excelling in their diverse professions and leading our society a better place to live. That is evident from our wide array of alumni honored with IAS, IES, IFS, IRS ranks, the state chief minister, spiritual leaders, entrepreneurs, educationists, and the list will continue long. I remember all our predecessors with great gratitude for extending the name and fame of St. Beckmans across the globe. We are gathered here for the 33rd Professor CSET Scaria Memorial Lecture. Professor CSET Scaria, a builder of our department, was a great academician and visionary who strived to improve the quality of teaching and research in Kerala's economics. I take this opportunity to salute before the fond memory of Professor CSET Scaria, one of our department's distinguished professor, commemorated as a very competent teacher with excellent interpersonal skills. I'm not going into the details of Professor CSET Scaria's contribution, as Tina Madam will enlist those later in this meeting. With these brief words of introduction, let me pass to the assigned duty of welcoming those who are present in this desktop memorial lecture. The president of this session is Father Reggie P. Kurian, our principal. He is guiding St. Beckmans with extensive academic exercises that inspire our students to dream high. We acknowledge all your support and welcome you, Father, to this lecture.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure to introduce our chief guest, Professor R. Ram Kumar. He's a professor at the School of Development Studies, Tata Institute of Social Science, Mumbai. Professor Ram Kumar received MSc in Agricultural Economics from Tamil Nadu Agriculture University and PhD in Economics from Indian Statistical Institute, Kolkata. He was formerly a visiting scholar at Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum. He joined TIS in 2006, where he continues to date. He is a non-ministerial member of the State Planning Board, Kerala, since 2016. Presently, his research is focused on agriculture and agrarian changes in rural India, agricultural credit, economic reforms and changes in rural livelihood. He is the author of the book Notebandi, Demonetization and India's Elusive Chase for Black Economy, published by Oxford University Press. Also, he has contributed 18 chapters to the edited books and volumes. He is an author of more than 25 excellent research articles published in peer-reviewed journals. He has overall 88 citations with H index 830. He is a noted speaker in agrarian economics and has given numerous interviews and written popular articles about different topics relevant to Indian economy. He is a famous blogger and a broadcaster too. I am extraordinarily grateful to you, sir, for accepting our invitation and delivering this lecture on a rescheduled date for us without any hesitation. I'm extending you a delightful welcome, sir. Head of the Department of Economics, Professor Johnson K. Joyce, is a capable team leader who constantly fine-tune his team members at this online teaching learning period. A pleasant welcome to you, sir. I welcome all our former heads of the department and faculty members who were the department's torch bearers for a quite long time. So lovely to have you with us today. Hearty welcome, dear teachers. We are grateful to acknowledging Professor Cesar Scaria's family members' support for this memorial lecture. Let me welcome Mrs. Tina Paul, our distinguished alumni, to share her profound memories of Cesar Scaria. She is the founder director of innovative startup Giftolexia Solutions Private Limited. Giftolexia's mission is to help children with dyslexia and other specific learning disabilities. They have developed India's first technology-enabled screening tool for the early identification of learning disabilities in children. She was the Center for Cellular Molecular Platforms list of 36 amazing women in our country who have made changes in our lives with profound science innovation. Acknowledging her social commitments, I welcome Tina Madam to this meeting.
Thank you.
MA Economics Program 2020 topper Ms. Arya V. Gopal and first semester topper Elizabeth James are on this platform to receive Cesar Scaria Award. Welcome, dear students. I welcome all my esteemed colleagues who are present here to attend this lecture. I also extend a cordial welcome to all our esteemed alumni who are present here online. The actual beneficiaries of this lecture is our dear students. I request to take maximum out of this lecture. Welcome you all. I again extend a very cordial welcome to everybody present here. Thank you, Ananda. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for the welcome address. Now, I would like to invite our principal, Father Rajiv Pigurian, for the presidential address.
Respected speaker of the day, Professor R. Ram Kumar sir, Joyce K. Joyce, Johnson K. Joyce, the head of the department, Mrs. Tina Paul, our alumnus, founder director of Giftolexia Solutions, other respected teachers, family members of Professor Cesar Scaria, and participants of Professor Cesar Scaria Memorial Lecture. A very good morning to all. St. Beckman's College, as Dr. Anila said, is getting ready to celebrate its centenary this academic year 21-22. On the occasion of 33rd Professor Cesar Scaria Memorial Lecture, SB remembers with great respect its great teachers. St. Beckman's Autonomous College was always blessed to be in the limelight of higher education of Kerala through its great teachers and eminent alumni. The 100-year legacy of excellence is purely on the basis of former teachers, former and present teachers, and the students who were and are part of SB. I congratulate the Department of Economics for conducting this memorial lecture without any break, and that too in great quality. We see the list of eminent previous speakers, and this year, another great person with a high profile, as Dr. Anila mentioned, is our speaker of the day. Once again, on behalf of SB College, I welcome you, Ramakumar sir. Also, I congratulate the Department of Economics for selecting a relevant topic, that is economic theory, agriculture, and neoliberalism, some critical thought. Our farmers from North India, mostly, are around Delhi protesting against 3 farm acts passed by the parliament. We all know that they are also fighting against this pandemic, and in December cold weather, and now the summer season of Delhi. We know that the alarming pandemic situation across the country has brought economic activity to a near halt. Amid this situation, the government is expecting that the agriculture sector could be a silver lining to Indian economy by the growth rate of 3%. I think it was mentioned by Niti Aayog. But we all know that it most probably will be only a big wish in the present scenario of farmers' protest. I think so. Yes. The Indian agricultural sector is also on the verge of significant transition. And that's why this topic becomes so relevant. The government claims that through the new agricultural policy, it allows farmers to sell their products to whomever and wherever they want. The neoliberal views of deregulation, eliminating price controls, lowering trade barriers, which is also known as free trade, aiming to increase the role of private sector, are all well fit in the new agricultural policies. The farm liberalization agenda of the government in the form of 3 bills and the response of farmers are all to be debated, and I am sure that this memorial lecture will surely show some lights to the situation of present India and its future. I wish all the participants a fruitful session. Also, I wish to mention about our great alumnus, Mrs. Tina Paul, who is remembering Professor C.Z. Scaria. Of course, with great respect, only we can remember Professor C.Z. Scaria. More than an academician, he was a great leader, organizer, and the one who always stood for the teachers. Mrs. Tina Paul, our alumnus, who did her PG, I think, along with our former HOD and professor, Dr. MP Philip. Madam, we are proud of you. You have developed an innovative startup, as it was mentioned in the, as it was mentioned by Dr. Anila, Giftolexia for groups who are in a way marginalized. I congratulate you, madam, for winning the Stanford Seed Spark India virtual pitch event in November 2020. And I wish all the success in all your endeavors.
Thank you, Father.
Now coming to my duty, I am very happy to inaugurate the 33rd Professor C.Z. Scaria Memorial Lecture. And I wish all of you a great and fruitful time. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. Now, Professor C.Z. Scaria was a gifted teacher and an eloquent orator, and had a passion for teaching many different subjects, with his favorite being microeconomics. His captivating way of teaching and his humorous exchange with students were among a few reasons he was much loved. Now, to tell us more about Professor C.Z. Scaria with colorful anecdotes, we would like to welcome Mrs. Tina Paul, Founding Director of Giftolexia Solutions Private Limited.
Thank you. I'm really grateful for the honor. Professor C.Z. is someone who's had a profound influence on me. We were the last batch of second MA students that he taught. So we kind of have a very, very close relationship with Professor. I very vividly remember the first day he came to our first MA class, and he would give us a reading list. And other than Dr. Manmohan Singh, there was no other Indian author in the list. And his classes were scintillating. You know, they were absolutely brilliant. He had you captivated. If you were in the class, for the love of the subject, we really looked forward to his classes, especially it was his last year before he retired, and he had many other duties. So we only had a very few sessions with him, but we literally looked forward to each of those sessions. Just imagine this, almost 35 years ago, in a small state of Kerala, in a small town of Changnasheri, in a big college like SB College, a big professor like Scaria introduced us to linear programming, St. Petersburg paradox, Bernoulli hypothesis, Newman-Morgenstern expected utility. I think this is what creates interest in students. He went beyond syllabus. His interest was not to teach what was there in the syllabus. And, his intent was to ignite that spark in students to create a love. And he successfully did that for large number of students across the years that he taught. So when I think about my college life at SB, yes, it's a co-ed college. And people often laugh when I say one of the most memorable events was the mock Viva. I don't know if you still have this. When we were there in the final year of MA, you have a Viva Voce and the department gives you a practice before that. So the entire department, all the professors are there. We had Professor Scaria, Professor K.K. Francis, Professor T.V. Abraham, Professor C.O. Graham, and the entire class sits in a room. And then you're asked, what is your favorite subject? And then they ask you questions on that. And almost all of the rest of my classmates, we were a small class of 15 or 16 students, all of them chose macroeconomics. And yeah, Cecil's favorite subject is micro, and he was dying to ask a question. And my name starts with T, so I was towards the fag end of the session. And my favorite then and now is always microeconomics. And he was delighted. Okay, I finally get a chance to ask a few questions. He started with a few simple questions and then went on to ask questions which are the so-called outside the syllabus questions. He delighted in asking, and I was even more delighted to answer. I think we were oblivious to the rest of the class, and it went on for a very, very long time. And to this day, it is a very, very memorable day for me. And another thing about Professor C said, which we try to follow, though we teach very young children, is he never pitched his class to the average student. So we normally, whenever there is a class, we have a tendency to pitch the class to the average student, thinking everybody will be involved. He basically pitched it beyond the smarties. So everybody had to do catch up. So, it was like really brilliant in the way he taught. He was a great orator. His depth and breadth of knowledge was unparalleled among his peers. So, and I remember Professor was a little disappointed that I didn't take up teaching. I didn't even work for a few years after college. But I'm definite that I've made you really proud, sir, today. We've started a startup for children with learning disabilities, and we always pitch our classes to beyond the smarties and make everybody catch up. And it is I think that's what I would request everybody to do. Don't underestimate your students, and don't think that if I teach this they won't understand, or I have to teach by the syllabus. Create that spark in your students, and that is what is long lasting. That love for learning, love for the subject is what will carry you all through your life. And having had such a strong foundation in business economics helps me immensely today as I run my own startup. So, നമ്മുടെ നാടൻ ഭാഷയെ പറഞ്ഞാൽ സാർ ഒരു സംഭവമായിരുന്നു. And I'm grateful to the department for keeping his memory alive. Even preparing for this was a very, very memorable event, and I got to do it twice. So, I think it's, there's a lot that we can learn from him, and I'm grateful to the department for continuing this. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about sir. Thank you, department. A special thanks to Anila. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for these memories and insight to the life of Professor C. Scaria. Now, I'd like to invite Professor R. Ram Kumar to deliver the memorial lecture on the topic Economic Theory, Agriculture, and Neoliberalism.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And good morning to everybody here. Dr. Anila Scaria, who was kind enough to extend this invitation to me. Father Reggie Kurian, the principal. I hope more principals of colleges in our country speak the language that he just spoke. I think you're blessed to have a principal who speaks that language. Mrs. Tina Paul, founder director of the Giftolexia Solutions Private Limited, about which I heard wonderful things in the last half an hour. And also students who are going to receive the awards here, and also Dr. Johnson K. Joyce, who is the head of the department. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important lecture. I'm a bit taken aback looking at the list of previous speakers at this memorial lecture. Many of them have been my teachers or my mentors or my peers in many ways, and I'm really humbled by this invitation extended to me. I also know that Professor Scaria was a towering name in the field of economics education in Kerala. As Mrs. Tina Paul mentioned a little while back, here was a towering professor from a small city who took students far beyond their comforts of laxity, took them to newer areas, difficult areas, raised their level of knowledge to the extent that he could, and he was surely going by the biography that is presented in the note that was given to me. He was certainly a wonderful human being as well, alongside being a great professor of economics. So I'm deeply humbled, very honored, privileged to be able to speak to you today on the eve of this memorial lecture for the year 2021. As I had mentioned to Dr. Anila, I would like to speak for about 45 minutes, not more than that. Online lectures are very boring, and I realize it even when I am speaking. So we should, I think I will compress my points to about 40 to 45 minutes, and then maybe we could have a set of question and answer sessions as well. So what I wanted to speak to you was about a certain theoretical or conceptual drift in the subject of economics, and keeping in mind agriculture in the forefront. Your principal spoke a little while back about what the idea or the concept of neoliberalism has done to Indian agriculture, how it is related closely to the ongoing farmer struggle and so on. They are very important matters about which I will come to towards the end in trying to contextualize my broader comments that I wish to deliver as part of the lecture today. Okay, so let me begin by saying that I am a votary of pluralism in economics. By pluralism, what I mean is we need a practice and an absorption of multiple theoretical concepts and ideas into our repertoire of knowledge. And that is something that is sorely missing in a subject like economics. A subject like economics, you students should always remember that it is an arena of power. It's an arena of power play, because this is where the rich make their money. This is where the businessmen make their profit. This is where the laborer tries to create space for getting higher wages. This is where the banker makes to make a profit with his interest. This is where the landlord makes to make a killing with his rent. right? So there are multiple stakeholders, as you call it today, in the sphere of economics, which you don't see in a subject like sociology or other subjects. Here, the stakes are very high. So the power play that happens in outside society with respect to material conditions, economic relations, money, profit, wages, interest, etc., all of that reflect in the different ideological streams within the subject of economics also. And that is what I want to focus on today. What I want to say today is that for a long period of time, with only short intervals in between, the subject of economics has been captured. Subject of economics has been monopolized, or to use the harsher word, hegemonized by a certain viewpoint in economic theory. And that has been extremely weakening to the spirit of economics, to the spirit of what we call the study of development as part of economics, the study of welfare of people as part of economics, right? So all these have been considerably weakened by this hegemonization of economic science, but by a certain narrow set of ideas. That and that narrow set of ideas are predominantly present in our textbooks also. Paul Samuelson once famously said, "I don't want to be the ruler of a country and waste my time ruling that country. What I want to do is I want to write the textbook of that country." Right? So I don't want to be a ruler. I'm fine if I'm able to write the textbook of that country. And he said that primarily because he knew that textbooks are the founding stones of how the intellect of a country, of people living in that country over a period of time develop, what they internalize, what they absorb as the normal. That is something that is something extremely important in the study of something hegemonizing a sphere. Right? You tend to think that is the a normal way of things, and something outside it is abnormal. Right? So the dominant ideology that hegemonizes or that has hegemonized economic science for a long period of time, that has hegemonized economics education and textbooks over a long period of time, has tended to give this impression that the only normal thing is the free market. The only normal thing is the demand and supply graph. The only normal thing is equilibrium. Any form of thinking outside the realms of these normally accepted forms of thinking with respect to economics is considered abnormal, right? And it's in that abnormality in this lecture that I seek liberation, right? That's what I'm trying to do today. I think this economics needs a rescue from this hegemonization of a certain free market ideology. And that is something that we need to focus on if we really want to democratize the sphere of economic education, economic thinking, economic policy, etc. So for that matter, I primarily wish to focus on what is the idea of heterodoxy in economics. Heterodox is the opposite of orthodox. So I'm trying to move away from the hegemony of the orthodox and trying to embrace the resistance or the antagonism thrown into the state of play by heterodoxies, the ideas of heterodox economics. This idea of heterodoxy has a very long history, if you know your economics rather well, because right from the time of the development of capitalism as a societal ideology itself, you will see that that the idea of a certain kind of thinking about economics had come to play. So if you look at what are usually called as the founding fathers of economics, not founding mothers, because they were not women, the founding fathers of economics, say Adam Smith or Ricardo or J.S. Mill or even Karl Marx, for example, you will see that they were all born in a time when the idea of feudalism, this feudal society, was dying off and the capitalist society was expanding or slowly beginning to grow. And what did they see around them? They saw something very interesting around them, which was not visible during the times of feudalism say a century or 2 centuries before their life. What did they see? They saw this new animal called surplus. Right? So this animal called surplus came about as a new thing with the coming of capitalism. Productivity was rising. New technologies were being used. More and more factories were being established. More and more workers were coming under one roof to work instead of being stuck in household enterprises. And this meant that the whole idea of thinking with respect to how our society functions completely changed. This is the context in which Smith wrote, Mill wrote, Malthus wrote, Ricardo wrote, Marx wrote, etc. And what did they see? They saw that this emergence of surplus, which was absent before that, is also coming to be associated with something more interesting, which is people want a part of the surplus. People want to capture, own a share of the surplus. I said earlier, the landlord wants the rent, the banker wants the interest, the capitalist wants the profit, and the worker wants his wages. Right? And this means that different vested interests within the society are vying for a space, vying for a piece of the cake, vying for a piece of the surplus, a share of the surplus. And this meant that the society cannot anymore be considered homogeneous. The society was deeply heterogeneous. And this understanding of this heterogeneity was the richness, was the source of the richness for the studies of Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, Marx, etc. Right? They understood that the society is not a homogeneous space where everybody looks at demand and supply and pays a price and then goes home. Right? It's not like that. People have vested interests and they will go to any extreme to exercise power to get a higher share of the surplus. That meant that economics is not simply a peaceful science. Right? Economics is actually a violent space. Right? The practice of economics is related to violent practices, brutal practices related to the capturing of a space or a share of the economic surplus that is produced in the new capitalist world. And that is how they built their economics. Right? It is from here that people like Marx built their idea of class. Right? The businessmen, the capitalists are a class. The workers are a class. The landlord is a class. Right? And these classes, right, to fight for what is due to them from the capitalist society. And this is what, for example, Marx said, gives rise to class struggle, class conflict. And what moves the society forward from one position to another position or one century to another century is who wins this class conflict, who wins this vying for a part of the cake, a part of the surplus that is produced by capitalism. Right? And this meant that the movement of society forward, the dynamics of the society that we live in, was traced by these scholars, not just Marx, but also Smith. Smith also wrote about importance of classes in society, though he didn't call it classes like Marx. Right? So did Ricardo, so did Malthus, so did Mill. All of them wrote about how the society is, particularly the economy. They didn't call it economy at that time, but the economy was an arena of power play, was an arena where different people applied power, used their power to become more powerful in society. And that is the context in which economics was actually born. Adam Smith is the father of economics. What we mean is that Adam Smith wrote the founding pieces of economics. Right? And those founding pieces of economics were founded or were constructed on this idea that the society is a heterogeneous space. And that is extremely important. I'm going to come back to this later. But this is, of course, if you're in your history of economic thought textbooks and so on, you will actually see it as the idea of classical political economy. Right? The classical political economy, thus, is the stream of thought or the school of thought whereby surplus was considered important, and the distribution question in economics. Right? It was not price, it was not demand supply or the minor stuff that we think about in our microeconomics textbooks. They thought about big questions, big answers, big matters. right? And that is how the idea of economics, the subject of economics, was actually born, though it was called political economy very appropriately at that time. It was not called economics as a result. It was called political economy because politics, the arena of power play, power relations, was central to the study and understanding of our economy and the subject of economics itself. And that is a foundational point that I want to begin this discussion from. So economics, if you see, was built from this foundation of assumption of heterogeneity, assumption of power relations in the society. But this was not long lasting. As we know, by the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the neoclassical revolution came about. What we call in economics as the marginalist revolution came into being. What did the marginalist revolution do? It completely set aside these questions of surplus, distribution of surplus, who earns what in the surplus, how is surplus distributed, are there different groups vying for different shares of the surplus, and so on. These questions were completely unimportant for neoclassical economics. What did this neoclassical economics then do? Well, as you know, Menger, Walras, others are culminating up to Marshall in 1920. What they did was they completely substituted the idea of political economy with what is called today as economics. Right? And they brought in the idea that markets are what are important in determining how the economies move ahead. Prices and price incentives are what it drives people forward in what they do and what they do not do. And equilibrium is what matters in society. And the famous demand-supply graph is famous for all of us. And this new idea, which completely replaced classical political economy and became the new dominant ideology in economics, thus became the staple for most textbooks in economics also. Almost all textbooks today start not with a history of economic thought, but with a clear statement of what a demand graph is, what a supply, what a demand curve is, what a supply curve is, and how equilibrium is reached, and what is the equilibrium price, and so on. Right? And this became the new dominant ideology in economics. Right? Now, Joan Robinson, who was a regular visitor to Kerala, the Center for Development Studies, etc., a towering heterodox thinker of the 20th century, famously said, if marginalist economics had come into being by addressing some of the major concerns that classical political economy had put forward, rejected them, and then given better answers to those questions, then it would have been understood as a very important movement ahead. But however, what the neoclassical economics or marginalist economics did was simply to ignore those questions. They did not give new answers to the questions that Smith or Marx posed. They simply asked new questions. They simply ignored the old questions and asked new questions. How much does a cup of tea cost? Right? Why is it that a cup of tea costed 4 rupees yesterday, and why is it costing 6 rupees today? Okay, for Joan Robinson, these are mundane issues. Right? The larger issues, that is, for example, what is the surplus in the society? How is the society growing? How is the society differentiated? And how do different groups in the society get what they have in the society? Questions of inequality, poverty, etc. All these were completely relegated from the mainstream of economics, and they today have captured the textbooks of economics. You take a textbook of economics today, what you will see is an undiluted, uncritical series of expositions related to this idea of marginalist economics, with all the fundamental questions asked by Adam Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, Marx, etc., relegated to, peripheralized into another course called the history of economic thought. right? They should be the central part of what we learn in economics, but instead they are pushed out as or pushed into the periphery as a subject which is simply called the history of economic thought, and you have to study it if you want to. It's mostly an elective in many colleges, and then you just have to know that history. That's all. But the core part is this textbook. Right? And that's how the idea of hegemony of the microeconomic thought, hegemony of neoclassical economics, the hegemony of the free market has been built into the minds of people studying economics. And this is exactly what Paul Samuelson said. I don't want to be the ruler of a country as long as I can write the textbook of that country. What do the textbooks do? The textbooks decide on, the textbooks mold the way in which people think, the way in which children think, the way in which students think, who are tomorrow's citizens, tomorrow's adults, tomorrow's policymakers, etc. Right? So this meant that there is an enormous view, a powerful view in our society, economics discipline itself, which considers only one narrow form of economic thought as important, as interesting, as something that will give you employment tomorrow, and so on and so forth. Correct? And this is something that is very problematic to begin with. And I wanted to say this as a starting point of what I wanted to say in the lecture as a whole. So by the time of the Second World War, or the post-war society came to being, this neoclassical economics that we are talking about here, which replaced the classical political economy of the earlier time, had come into a serious crisis. This serious crisis was because it faced a serious problem of credibility with the coming of the Great Depression of 1929. The Great Depression of the 1929 was a serious question mark over the efficacy of the free market, the efficacy of the desirability of looking for equilibriums when when it is more an exception than the norm being the consistent regular presence of disequilibriums or even multiple equilibriums. And this meant that the subject of economics, as rewritten at that time by another economist called John Maynard Keynes, the Keynesian revolution, came to be the dominant form of thinking by the 1930s and 1940s. This came to be the new consensus in economics. But if you see this period very closely, right, you'll see that there is a strong element of power play going on within the field of economics itself. For example, if you look at the 1950s in the United States, Joseph McCarthy was the Secretary of State of the United States through the 1950s, inaugurated, and this will not be there in any economics textbook, and this is important that all economics students know of this history also. There was some kind of what you call today as ethnic cleansing. There was an ideological cleansing of economics in American universities in the 1950s. There was a fascistic onslaught of the American state on American universities in the 1950s, whereby any economist, any scholar who would be even remotely considered a votary of heterodoxy in economics, heterodoxy in economic thinking, was actually branded as a leftist, as a Marxist, as a communist, and was actually disbanded from the university, dismissed from universities. Their tenures were terminated. Many who were considered as part of the thinking differently, thinking outside the orthodox, were considered as abnormal scholars, and they were not given appointments, they were not given tenures, they were not given project fundings, etc. They were called to the parliament, questioned for their communist activities and so on. And this, remember, this is not something that happened in economics alone in that period of time. This also happened even in fields of culture, like movies. Okay, those of you who have seen the movie Trumbo will actually know the onslaught that Ronald Reagan, as the president of the American Motion Pictures Association, had inaugurated against any unorthodox thinker, filmmaker in American in Hollywood itself. That is, anybody who spoke about workers' rights, higher wages, minimum wages, etc., was immediately branded as a communist and was actually punished for that purpose. Nobody gave him films, nobody gave them scripts to write, and they were slowly, over a period of time, shut out from the film industry of the United States. This happened in economics also. Thus, American universities were in this period cleansed of much of the dirt, as they call it. Right, and a free space was created for the practice of an unadulterated market economics that we see in the microeconomics textbooks of today. And this is something that students of economics should know about. Pluralism in economics was killed by an ideological project worldwide, and that included deciding who should teach, that included deciding what should be the textbook, that included deciding what should be and what should not be taught as part of economics. So economics is not a normal science of a peaceful science, as somebody would like to call it. It's actually quite a violent space, metaphorically at least. So this is extremely important to understand when we try to understand economics in its plurality. Okay, how much ever the plurality is absent in the economics that we see today. So if you come to the post-war period, the short 20 years that we had with Keynesian economics, the idea of agriculture that I'm going to speak of today had developed major changes. For example, many authors of this time, for example, Rosenstein, Rodin, Arthur Lewis, etc., all these economists came out with unorthodox theories, unorthodox concepts in economics, right? The big push was an unorthodox concept at that point of time. A big push theory is fundamentally a non-equilibrium concept. Right? It does not like equilibrium. The moment you reach an equilibrium, the big push pushes you out of that equilibrium. So it's always a movement out of equilibriums, as you will closely see in Rosenstein Rodin's work. If you see Arthur Lewis's work, it is a constant movement of people from the traditional to modern sectors. Right? The Lewis model, for example, is an excellent example in this regard. How a society changes, modernizes from agriculture to industry, and that is how, with Rodin, with Lewis, and so on, economics also became a study of structures. And that was a very important movement out of the equilibrium economics practiced by marginalists of the earlier time. What Rodin, Lewis, etc., hardly Marxists of any kind, but certainly what they came to be called as structuralists of that time, or even institutionalists of that time, they tried to inaugurate a new area in economics, create a new space in economics whereby unorthodox ideas, which are actually practical, which actually were part of the Keynesian revolution, which actually were part of the actual policies followed by post-war countries which became independent, like, for example, South Korea, Taiwan, Mexico, etc. All of them. This came out to be a very important branch out of how economists began to think about their subject. This is extremely important phase in the development of development economics itself. It is in this time that the founding idea of agriculture comes into being in one particular way, which is the idea of institutional change. It was understood that throughout the colonial period and prior to that, most countries, the rural societies in many countries were marked by some kind of pre-capitalist societal framework, some kind of feudal or even semi-feudal kinds of framework, whereby big landlords existed who practiced oppressive forms of tenancy with considerable presence of usury in the form of money lenders and so on. So the rural society was seen as a highly exploitative space and was characterized as pre-capitalist. So what is the idea? The idea is to end that pre-capitalist forms of society and bring into play more capitalist kinds of society, more capitalist forms of economy. And this required, as all of them put forward in one voice, a change in the relations of production in the rural areas. That meant that land reform, for example, came out as a very important instrument of institutional change in these countries. South Korea, Taiwan, or countries like Japan of that post-Hiroshima Japan, right? All these countries, if you see, you will see that they did not develop their economy. They did not industrialize to the extent that they have industrialized today, just by following some policy, right? From some allowing markets to work and so on. That's completely wrong. If you look closely at the history of South Korea, the history of Taiwan, the history of Japan, etc., you will see that they all began their developmental processes by reforming their agricultures. And by reforming their agriculture, I'm not talking about liberalizing their agriculture, right? I'm talking about the state going in and acting very decisively to change the distribution of or the ownership of resources in the countryside, to create a new organization of production in agriculture, and thereby inaugurate a process of institutional change in agriculture. Right? This institutional change became the starting point of developmental policy of developing countries in the post-war period. And that is the defining contribution of Keynesian economics in the 1950s and 1960s. So every country tried to do land reform. Kerala, for example, was a country which entered into implementing land reform in a big way, which completely changed the society in rather fundamental ways, as we know today. So you do the land reform, you completely change the organization of production of agriculture, invest in agriculture, invest in rural education, thereby allow productivity to rise, allow living standards of people to rise. And what will happen if this happens? If this happens, then industrialization becomes easier. Industrialization becomes easier because the expanded purchasing power that is created in agriculture as a result of this growth in agriculture can act as a trigger, as a market for industrial goods. Thus, the institutional change in agriculture also demolishes the agrarian barrier to industrial growth. Right? And this institutional form of looking at the agriculture and agricultural change, agrarian change, may I say, was very important in this period. And this is extremely this feature of development economics in the 1950s and 1960s threatened to dislodge the earlier equilibrium idea, the earlier marginalist idea in economics, whereby the state or the government was supposed to just stand back and ensure that markets work well. Right? This new understanding of the 1950s and 60s questioned the neoclassical idea and said that it needs the state to interfere. It needs the state to intervene, to invest, to decide policy, to regulate, etc., in the sphere of agriculture through land reform, public investment in irrigation, rural education, rural public health, etc. These were fundamental to institutional change, and none of this can be actually created by the market, because most of these education, for example, is a public good. Health, for example, is a public good. All these can be created only by the state. Right? So two things. So the idea of institutional change, the importance of state intervention. These two were very important features of the new kind of economics that came about in the 1950s and 1960s, even as, and that's very important, even as parallelly the cleansing of American universities in terms of how textbooks are written and so on is actually continuing. Right? So you have a very tense period of the 1950s and 60s, whereby you have some progressive policies being followed, some progressive ideas in economics coming about, thanks to structuralists and institutionalists, but at the same time, a very strong ground being prepared for a sabotage by the dominant thinkers in the field, particularly by cleansing universities, planning out textbooks in a particular form, etc. This is a fascinating history of economics in the post-war period that all of you should try to read up at some point of time. And because without this idea, because without an idea of this power play, it'll be increasingly impossible to understand the context of different theories that you're actually studying. There are large number of textbooks that will lead you to this kind of discussion. But again, this is where I come to the core of my lecture. This idea of institutional change led by the state, which was becoming a very important idea in the 1950s and 60s, was challenged again by the late 60s and early 70s. And that is how finally the idea of globalization comes into being by the 1970s and 1980s as the new hegemony, the new dominant field, dislodging the Keynesian consensus of the 1950s and 1960s. This is another new era that is born from the 1970s. And what happens here? This in this particular view of things, what you had is, for example, the classic author in this is the American economist called Theodore Schultz. What did Theodore Schultz say? Theodore Schultz addressed the very question that these institutional thinkers were concerned with. That is, land reform should be done, institutional change should be effected in rural areas, and thus agriculture should be modernized, etc. And this idea was questioned by Theodore Schultz, a Nobel Prize winner later. Schultz basically came out and said that, look, you are basically saying that traditional agriculture is backward. And traditional agriculture requires institutional change to become non-traditional or modern. But I'm here going to say that traditional agriculture is not modern. Traditional agriculture is very much an economic equilibrium of its own. In his 1964 textbook, Transforming Traditional Agriculture, Theodore Schultz famously said that I simply cannot say that traditional agriculture is a kind of disequilibrium. Traditional agriculture is actually an equilibrium. Right? The institutional thinkers had said that traditional agriculture is a disequilibrium. It is marked by distortions in the market, factor markets, land market, labor market, capital market, etc., and hence needs institutional reform. But Schultz said, who said they are imperfect? They are perfect. They are perfect markets. The land market under feudalism is a perfect market. The labor market under feudalism is a perfect market. The credit market under moneylenders is a perfect market. You are actually calling it imperfect. It's not imperfect. It is actually perfect. So traditional agriculture is indeed an economic equilibrium. This is the idea that Schultz famously put out. That's his famous hypothesis: poor but efficient. Yes, I'll agree that people living in that society are poor, but don't call them inefficient. And thus Schultz's theory came: poor but efficient. The hypothesis of being poor but efficient. This completely revolutionized economics in that era, right? And this came out. This came to be that the traditional agriculture does not require land reform, does not require investment by the state, does not require state-directed institutional change. Became the new hegemonic idea. Land reform was thus pushed out of the agenda. Public investment was thus pushed out of the agenda. Right? And what did they say? The only thing, Schultz said, that can actually make people less poor from the state of traditional agriculture that they are in is technical change. Only technical change can actually lead to a movement of that society from one equilibrium to the next equilibrium. But it will still be another equilibrium. It's not a non-equilibrium concept that Schultz put forward. It's still an equilibrium. Right? And this onslaught on institutional change, the importance of institutional change in economic policy was the foundational idea in the creation of the consensus around globalization today, consensus around liberalization today. This was how globally the process of liberalization of agriculture was inaugurated in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, which crystallized, got more cemented in the 1980s, as we know. So this argument of Schultz primarily put forward the idea. So the earlier Marxists or structuralists, all of them thought that rural society is not homogeneous. Rural society is heterogeneous, which was an idea borrowed from classical political economy, right? But what did the neoclassical economists say, and what did Schulz further try to crystallize? No, peasants are largely a homogeneous society, a homogeneous class, with no differentiations around them. They are rational thinking people. This idea of rationality became very central. Everybody thinks rational. And everybody takes rational decisions. They respond to prices. They respond to price incentives. And the only way policy can change the behavior of people, the policy can influence the behavior of people, is by setting incentives and disincentives via the market, via the prices. Trying to intervene, regulate at all will actually create more problems than solve the problem. This became the new dominant ideology. This became the new dominant hegemony in economics. And textbooks backed up this idea with new theories, with new arguments, which allowed a further reinforcing of this as the new normal in economic science and economic policy. Agriculture was not free from this also. So you can see that earlier institutionalists thought that sharecropping is actually an inefficient institution. Usury is an inefficient and exploitative institution. Landlordism is an inefficient and exploitative institution. But Schulzians came and said that all these three arguments are wrong. The land market under feudalism is actually a perfect market. Right? Peasants are actually rational. They're actually responding to price incentives. They're actually minimizing costs at every stage of their economic activity. Right? So this, so the land market is rational. Come to the labor market. Lewis, for example, had founded his whole theory on the idea of surplus labor. That there is enormous surplus labor in rural areas, which needs to be shifted to industry or another modern enterprise. But Schulzians came and said, what is surplus labor? There is nothing called surplus labor. Remember, surplus labor is something that is anathema to free market economies, to neoclassical economies. You know why? Because if they put forward the idea of equilibrium, and equilibrium by definition means that all resources are fully employed. Right? All resources are fully employed. If all resources are fully employed, and if there is an equilibrium, as you argue to be, then by definition, there can be no surplus labor. The moment neoclassical economists agree that there is surplus labor in the society, the very foundation of their theory collapses like a house of cards. Right? So they simply cannot say there is no surplus labor. There is surplus labor, I'm sorry. They simply cannot say there is surplus labor. They have to consistently say there is no surplus labor. The moment they say there is surplus labor, the idea of equilibrium collapses, because that means the equilibrium that you were celebrating till yesterday did not have full employment of resources. Then why is there so much of unemployment around us? Why is not everyone employed around us? Right? These questions were asked, but shoved aside. So sharecropping was considered an efficient institution. Surplus labor was dismissed away as unimportant. Right? And usury. Okay. Why do moneylenders lend at very high levels of interest? Institutionalists, structuralists, Marxists, and all said that, look, this is because you did not have good public banks. If you bring in good public banks, which will be able to give loans to people at low interest rates, then this disequilibrium can be corrected. But then, as is their wont, neoclassicals came and asked, who told you that high interest rates are a sign of disequilibrium? 120% interest rate, who told you that is actually a sign of inefficiency or disequilibrium? It is actually an equilibrium. 120% interest rate. Is it an equilibrium? Is it an efficient? Is it the sign of an efficient market? They would say yes. And why would that be? They would say that usually this high levels of interest rate that you see is simply the presence of high transaction costs in the market. Right? The lender is not sure about whether the borrower will actually give back the money or not. So there is a high element of risk that he's taking in giving that loan, and it as a transaction cost in the calculation of interest rate, and that's how the interest rate becomes high. Not because of anything else, not because he's a bad guy, not because he's an exploitative person. The moneylender is actually a nice guy. He's working as a rational economic agent in the society. Right? And thus you will see development economics textbooks written. Debraj Ray, that celebrated development economics textbooks, is written in this fundamentally ideologically biased form. But nobody questions such textbooks. Everybody teaches those textbooks as if it is the normal, as if it is the way in which economies actually run, markets actually function. Every critical element to every critical challenge to that kind of theoretical exposition is conveniently pushed to a footnote or completely kept out of the textbooks by all these authors. That's how the new normal was created. The new normal was created by a complete sidelining of all non-orthodox, heterodox voices in the theoretical sphere. So this is the way in. So the old idea of land reform, public investment, etc., got pushed aside, and what you have as a result is a new consensus around rural, perfectly functioning rural markets, right? Land market, labor market, credit market, etc., all functioning in an efficient form to bring about a functioning economic equilibrium in the rural areas. So this new consensus has been challenged from within economics also. I'm not denying that. For example, the idea of new development economics that people like Joseph Stiglitz, etc., practiced from the 1980s onwards, challenged this from within the mainstream economics itself. They were not structuralists, Marxists, or institutionalists, etc. They were core neoclassical economists at one point of their time, but they challenged it from within. It was a dissent from within, which is what came to be known as the new development economics. Thus, they said, for example, if the old neoclassical economics said that markets are present everywhere, these people said, no, markets are not present everywhere. Ronald Coase was wrong, right? Markets are absent in a large number of spheres. And that's where state intervention becomes necessary. You cannot deny state intervention. That became a dissenting idea from within economics. The second idea is, the old idea was that markets are always efficient, right? But the new development economics said, no, markets are not always efficient. Markets are functional, maybe, but they're certainly imperfect. Many markets, most markets are imperfect, right? And you have to work with that assumption that markets are not perfect, but imperfect. That came to be another dissenting voice from within economics. The third point is everything, equilibrium is Pareto efficient. Remember Wilfredo Pareto, right? You cannot make anybody better off without making somebody else worse off, right? That idea of Pareto efficiency was completely rejected by these new development economies, like, for example, Stiglitz. So that was a third dissenting voice from within economics. So the fourth point is that all of them in the earlier space said no to state intervention. Here, state intervention was actually welcomed in a large number of spheres. Another question, peasants are always considered as rational in the old economics. Right? Here, peasants are not considered to be rational. They're not considered to be irrational, but they're considered to be only reasonably rational, not more than that. Right? Earlier economics thought that everybody working in the market, every agent in the market had full information. The new economy said, no, everybody does not have full information. Like famous Akerlof example of lemons comes into mind, isn't it? Where the idea of asymmetric information comes into play. Every information has a cost. And these costs are present in the form of transaction costs, which will actually decide whether how good your equilibrium is and how bad your equilibrium is. Right? Finally, the old idea did not calculate ideas of discuss questions of risk and so on. These new ideas in development economics brought risk into a big way into understanding economics in agriculture. So you can see that here we are not talking about Marxists or structuralists or institutionalists. From within people who practiced mainstream economics itself, the orthodoxy was questioned, right? And people like Stiglitz played a very important role in questioning the orthodoxy from within, right? And this again, this finds its place in many textbooks, of course, though the old institutional ideas are still out of textbooks when you study questions related to agriculture and so on. Now, apart from what is the other end? If you look at this spectrum, this is a spectrum of thought. What is the other end? The Marxists, for example, okay, they have a very fundamentally different way of looking at the problem that we just discussed. They completely reject the idea that the peasantry is homogeneous. Right? They insist that peasantry is heterogeneous. Why? Because the moment you say peasantry is heterogeneous, you cannot simply create a utility function for a representative agent, as neoclassicals do, maximize it, and say this holds for the whole society. The moment you bring in the idea of heterogeneity, it means that the idea of a representative agent is meaningless, right? Because you'll have to say which class does he represent then, right? So Marxists completely reject the idea of homogeneity and insist on heterogeneity as a premise in these discussions. Second, the idea of two people working together, the landlord and the worker, the capitalist and the worker working together. It is not a relation of mutuality, Marxists would say, as neoclassicals would try to look at it. It is not a question of mutuality. It is actually a question of an exploitative relationship, and you will have to see it that way. That is the second insistence that Marxists would have in these areas. Third is, even people like Stiglitz go to the extent only of talking about information asymmetry, right? And information has costs, transaction costs, and so on. But Marxists would say, no, that's not sufficient yet. You should not call it information asymmetry. You should actually call it power play, power relations. Okay, calling it information asymmetry is actually a dumbing down of a serious problem. You should actually call it by a more serious and fundamental term, which is power. Right? And that's a third insistence that Marxists would have. Fourth insistence that Marxists would have is societies are not static. An equilibrium arises from the assumption of static. The moment you understand that economies are fluid and dynamic, the very idea of equilibrium loses its meaning. Right? That is how Marxists insist on the idea of seeing the society as a dynamic concept, the economy as a dynamic space, and not simply a static space. You look at demand and supply, you reach an equilibrium, and you're content there. You stay there for a long time. Right? That's not working. That's not on. Right? So these are fundamental. So what I was trying to say here, okay, with the example of agriculture that I use, is that economics is a highly contentious area. Right? A small lecture like this is insufficient to throw enormous amount of light on the fine points of the debate that I have been dealing with. I deliberately kept a bird's eye view of the matter. I did not go into the details of the working of the market theories, etc. I wanted to give you a historical overview of how the discipline of economics evolved over a period of time using the illustration of agriculture. What we call neoliberalism in agriculture today, which is there in the title of my lecture, is simply this practice of an uncritical, this practice of the orthodox economic theory in agriculture, considering institutional change as irrelevant, considering the presence of state as a regulator, as an investor in the economy as irrelevant and inefficient, right? Pushing the market ahead to take care of core economic problems. This is the core idea of neoliberalism in agriculture and in economy as a whole. the idea of heterodoxy that I tried to insert into the debate here, beginning from classical political economy, running through Keynes, and to the dissenters of today, is that there is there should be enormous space that should be opened up for new voices, new unorthodox voices in economics. The way in which we have written textbooks, the way in which we have taught economics, the way in which we have fashioned economics as a subject has, over a period of time, killed pluralism, killed unorthodoxies. And that has made the subject of economics very poor in terms of its knowledge base and intellect. We need a new economics. That economics should actually challenge the orthodoxies, create more spaces for more plural debates in the classrooms. Right? Not simply teach a theory and leave it there as the law of nature. We should increasingly question these theories in the classroom, put them to critical analysis, and give space for new theories, institutional theories, structuralist theories, Marxist theories, etc., in the classroom. And that is the only way in which we can, over a long period of time, rescue economics from its dismal state of today, from its complete lack of credibility in the eyes of common people today, and to restore to it a sense of richness, a sense of intellectual strength that professors like C.S. Scaria, I'm sure, imbibed during their time of study or during their time of practice of economics. That is extremely important to revive economics. And that is where I hope lectures like Dr. Scaria's, like the memorial lecture of Dr. Scaria, will actually create those new spaces of debate, right? Encourage students to read outside orthodoxies, encourage teachers to teach outside orthodoxies, right? And not, as I said, not relegate them to history of economic thought and so on, rather bring them right into the center of your discussions, not relegate them into the periphery, but bring them into the mainstream. Compare them with the dominant theories of the day and let students decide what is the best theory. And I hope that lectures like this are able to create that new culture of learning and research in economics, which we badly need in the troubled times of today. Thank you very much for this opportunity given to me to speak here. I'm very thankful to St. Bergsman's College and its authorities for giving me this opportunity. I will close my lecture here. I wish the college all the best. I wish the department all the best, and I hope that you will be able to continue this tradition into the future in a very big way. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, I would like to open up the call to the students and who would like to and ask some questions to sir regarding the topic. I guess I have a question to start if and other students can follow. Sir, is neoliberalism always a right-wing political tool, or does it have any merit when it comes to actual ways in solving problems, or as a reaction to like conventional leftist economics or public theory?
No, look, neoliberalism is the ideology of the dominant thinking of today, right? We cannot say that the free market economy is completely stagnant or completely ineffective in doing anything at all. That's not what we are saying. The economy, the world around us has changed tremendously thanks to different processes around us, including of the market. So the point is not that. The point here is to see that the way in which we think about economics allows space for diversity. That's what I was going to say. right? Neoliberalism, what it has done over a period of time is that it has narrowed down the rich space that economics and political economy once provided. It has narrowed down that alley. That was a huge highway, right, with many lanes, but now it is actually a narrow alley in the discipline, and that narrow alley does not have space, has denied space to plural voices of pluralism, voices of criticism from outside. Right? And what it and thus you have to see. So that's one. That's a point I wanted to make in the lecture. But there is also an additional point, which if you closely watch writers like David Harvey and all writing about neoliberalism, what they say that the neoliberalism is an ideology also of a class society. Okay, the new class society, the new capitalist society that came into being needed a dominant ideology to ensure that nothing threatened it also. So the capitalist economy that was created needed a theory to back it up, needed a theory to ensure that all critical voices are silenced also. So the practice of a particular kind of economics over the last 25, 30, 40 years is also a reflection of a certain element of power play in our society itself, whereby certain sections of the society want to reaffirm, want to increase, or want to cement their position of power in the society, want to ensure that is continued unchallenged for a longer period of time, and for that all dissenting theories, all critical theories have to be sidelined, have to be silenced, right? And thus, my comment on how economics grew in that from that highway into that narrow alley that I just mentioned is a reflection of the desire of the dominant section of our society to ensure that a certain ideology runs without challenge, right? And that, so keeping out institutionalists, keeping out structuralists, keeping out Marxists, etc., is part of that larger plan of cementing the power of that class in the society. So neoliberalism is also then an instrument of a class society, right? It's an instrument. So one is this death of diversity in this in the study of economics, in the teaching of economics, and so on. The other is this whole need to understand neoliberalism as the ideology of the dominant class in the society. That's also there.
Thank you, sir. In the chat box, there's a Listen Abraham has posted a question I'd like to ask on his behalf. Are not economic ideologies more political these days, and the allegiances to the left or right-wing ideologies more fluid than it has ever been?
You know, it was a century back that Vladimir Lenin of USSR wrote that politics is nothing but concentrated economics, right? Politics is nothing but concentrated economics, and that's a lot of people keep citing this to make a point. But the point is, there was never the phrase in your question these days, right, tends to create a romantic image of the past where everything was very nice, non-political, right? That is completely wrong. Right from the day economics was born, economics was political. Right from the day of its birth, economics was political. And that's what I was trying to say, that even when Adam Smith wrote about economics, he was trying to say what does the worker do? What does the businessman do? What does the banker do to get their share in the surplus? What is that effort to get more share in the surplus? It is a political activity. So economic activity is always political activity, and hence economics is always political. It was never the case. I would be surprised if there ever was an era in our humankind where the practice of economics was not political. Everybody wants to keep their wealth. Everybody wants to keep others poor. Right? So what is that action? That is a political action. Right? And anything that studies that subject will also be political. Right? So the first point is to understand that there is nothing that is apolitical with respect to economics. Sometimes our textbooks give that impression that a lot of this is apolitical. That is part of the problem. That's what I was trying to say. That is part of the problem. That's completely wrong. Right? So the question of allegiance to the right or left is a natural if it is a political thing. If what we are thinking about is a concentrated political problem, then how can you avoid people taking positions to the left, right, center left, center right, etc.? That's part of the game. Right? So that need not worry us too much. The people taking different positions in the spectrum was always true. There was never extreme cases. There were always positions in between, to the left of the middle, to the right of the middle, and so on. That is what I call as the richness of economics. Those multiple positions, to the left, to the right, to the center, and so on. And what I was trying to argue for is that the classroom should be more representative of that diversity. That diversity of opinions and views. That diversity has been lost. My argument was to bring back the diversity into the classroom. That's what I was trying to say. It's not more fluid or less fluid today compared. It was always as fluid as today or as solid as today. So nothing has changed with respect to that particular aspect that is raised in your question. I was responding to Lishan Abraham here. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to request all the students to post the questions in the chat box, so it will be easier for me to ask them directly to sir. So next question is by Thomas Patilchira, sir. You promised to contextualize the farmer struggle. Can you share your views briefly on that topic?
I did that towards the end of my lecture, but I will just spend 2 minutes on that again. What I was trying to say was this whole idea of the absence of institutional understanding of economics and the embrace of a certain free market ideology with respect to economics was a feature of the way economics became a dominant space in the last 30 or 40 years. That was what I was trying to say towards the end of my lecture. The debate related to the farm loss in India and farmer struggle in India today is very reflective of that. In the sense, what are the farmers struggling against? They are struggling against a policy of the state, a planned policy of the state, which tries to replace regulation with deregulation. There is a regulated APMC market that is present in rural areas, which is functioning. It has its own problems, but it has been functioning rather okay for the last 30 or 40 years in the rural areas of India. What the government is doing is to remove that regulated space and create deregulated spaces, free for the market, free for big players, right? And replace regulation with deregulation, remove all regulations. And that is very much in line with the idea of economics and the growing dominance in economics that I just mentioned, whereby institutions are considered less important, right? And market signals are considered more important. Right? It is a reflection of that shift in the way of thinking in economics itself. So it's not surprising. It's not a new thing. So in that sense, the debate related to farm loss is very much related to the shift in economics that I tried to flag during the last part of my lecture. So you bring in contract farming, but you bring in a law for contract farming which completely does away with the need to regulate contract farming. Right? You bring in a law on Essential Commodities Act which completely takes away stock limits for traders, which are regulations. And by removing those regulations, you think that more private investment will come into storage, warehousing, etc. So all the three acts that are being discussed here, APMC acts, which remove regulation and aim for deregulation. Contract Farming Act, which creates a space, a completely deregulated space for the practice of contract farming in Indian agriculture. The Essential Commodities Amendment Act, which actually creates space for complete freedom for traders to practice trade by black marketeering, hoarding, or whatever they want in a completely deregulated space. What are all these things? All these three laws, thus, are reflective of the kind of shift in economics that I mentioned in the last part of my lecture. That's what I would say.
Okay, sir. So next question is again by Thomas Patalchera. More than the plurality of economic theories, shouldn't there be invocation of all disciplines, including theology, even philosophy and psychology?
I'm completely open to that. I was trying to say that the idea of I was not talking about the topic of my lecture today was not about how to make economics interdisciplinary. Okay, that's a theme for a completely different lecture. Right? I was only speaking about a limited topic, which is the emergence of a certain dominance of an ideology within the practice and thinking around economics. That's what I was worrying about. Now, what you are asking is, you are asking me to give a completely new one-hour lecture on how to make economics more interdisciplinary. I'd be happy to speak about it, but another time. But I agree with your core argument here that economics has to absorb lessons from other disciplines, sociology, political science, history, philosophy, psychology, etc., in trying to enrich its philosophical base. There's no doubt about it. I completely agree with you. And that plurality should also form a part of thinking and teaching and research in economics. I agree with you.
Next question is by Alina and Matthew. History of economic thought evolved based on the contemporary economic situation of the region, and various schools of thought have evolved over time. Some dominated for some point of time and kept on changing. So how is it actually right to say that economic ideas could be narrowed to an alley?
It is completely wrong to say that economic ideas could be narrowed down to an alley. That was precisely the point I was trying to make. My illustration of this of the presence of a 5-lane highway earlier, Marxists, institutionalists, structuralists, free marketeers included, all of them taking one lane for them, is completely converted into all the other with all the other voices being silenced or sidelined. There is only one small alley now, which is this neoclassical free market ideology, which dominates the space. That is a sign of economics losing its pluralism or richness of an earlier period and converting itself to a very narrow discipline. I was lamenting the loss of that richness when I was giving the analogy of highway to an alley. I hope you get my message there. And in that sense, I completely agree with you.
Thank you, sir. I guess there are no more questions, and I would like to hand over to our HOD, sir, for the next row.
Most respected dignitaries. So we are happy to announce 2 scholarships in memory of late Professor Cesar Scaria. First one is Professor Cesar Scaria Memorial Endowment instituted by the family of late Professor Cesar Scaria. And this year's award goes to Miss Elizabeth James who secured highest marks in MA Economics the first semester during the academic year 2019-20. And the second award, Prof. C. Scaria Memorial Scholarship instituted by Sabu Cherian Punnakudi in memory of his beloved teacher, C. Scaria. And this year's award goes to Arya V. Gopal, who was the topper for MA Economics for the academic year 2018-20. Distribute the scholarship in the department once we meet in person. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, as we come to the end of the program, I would like to invite our HOD, Dr. Johnson K. Joyce, sir, for the vote of thanks.
Honorable guest of the day, Professor R. Ram Kumar, Mrs. Tina Paul, and my dear fellow participants of the lecture. It is a privilege and great joy for me to extend a vote of thanks to all those who have contributed in one way or the other to make this lecture a success. First of all, I thank God Almighty for having provided us with this blissful day, for His benevolence, and helped us to bring in place all the arrangements for the day. First of all, let me thank the chief guest of the day, Professor R. Ram Kumar, and we have a great desire to have him as a resource person for this year's lecture. We have created some trouble for him by postponing the program initially, and still he remained with us for this program. With immense pleasure, we acknowledge our sincere thanks and gratitude to Professor Ram Kumar for being with us for this memorial lecture. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Our sincere thanks to Reverend Father Rajiv P. Kurian, our principal of the college, for his constant support in all our department initiatives. Thank you, Father. We have Tina Paul with us for remembering Professor C. Scaria. And as we all know, she is a successful entrepreneur. And moreover, she had found to be with us on this day. On behalf of the department, we extend you our heartfelt thanks. Thank you, ma'am. Our words of appreciation to Sabu Cherian Punnakudi and also to the family members of late Professor C. Scaria for instituting the scholarships for the meritorious PG students of the department. Thank you very much. We have 3 memorial lectures. All of them were funded by the general contributions from the family members of teachers or students of our department. This year, we are able to top up Caesar and KK Francis Memorial Lecture Fund due to the generous contribution by Dr. M. Philip, our former HOD. He has contributed rupees 50,000 each towards the Caesar Scaria Memorial Lecture Fund and also the KK Francis Memorial Lecture Fund. Thank you, Dr. M. Philip. I would like to thanks to our former teachers of the department who are present here and who built and elevate the department to the present status. I have a special mention to Dr. Scaria, who was behind this lecture for the last 2 months and effort to get the resource person and to execute this program. Thank you very much, Dr. Scaria. Thanks to all the current faculty members of the department, we have a great team effort and we are closely knit together. Thank you for the wonderful effort for the day. Thanks to department students and also the comparing team. And thank you very much for all the participants, teachers, students from the other departments, and also our alumni members. And thank you very much. With this, I conclude. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Tina ma'am. Thank you.